disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dan, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 18th and 19th, 2026, Saturday-Sunday weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Starting on the front cover above the fold, U.S. and Iran signal easing of tensions, by Somerset, Benoit Facon, and Lawrence Norman. A top Iranian official raised hopes of a breakthrough in the standoff between Washington and Tehran when he said the Strait of Hormuz is, quote, completely open, while President Trump said a U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports would remain in force, stirring uncertainty among shippers in the region. Oil prices plunged and stocks rose after the Iran official's declaration. Brent crude futures fell 9.1% to $90.38 a barrel, while the U.S. benchmark declined 11% to 83.85 a barrel. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ Composites indexes finished at fresh records. Trump later said on social media, after initially repeating Iran's announcement about the opened strait, that the U.S.'s blockade of Iranian ports would remain in place until, quote, and this is in all caps, our transaction with Iran is 100% complete. He didn't specify what that transaction entails, but said it should go very quickly because most points have been negotiated. Trump's announcement suggested the economic pressure will remain in full effect until Iran agrees to a list of U.S. demands involving its nuclear program and missile and drone stockpile. On Thursday, the U.S. announced an expansion of its crackdown on commercial ships linked to Iran and said it would also go after tankers carrying Iranian oil. The announcement by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi that the Hormuz Strait, through which about 20% of the world's oil flows, is open appeared to be an effort to signal a compromise at a critical moment for diplomacy. The comments came as a newly struck ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon appeared to be holding on its first day. The 10-day truce began at midnight local time after weeks of fighting between the Israeli military and the Iran-backed Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. Araghchi's statement appears more aimed at unlocking negotiation than unblocking the Strait of Hormuz, said Michael Singh, a former senior director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. An Iranian diplomat and another person familiar with the talks agreed Araghchi was aiming to deliver a confidence-building measure to generate goodwill ahead of possible talks. Talks between the U.S. and Iran haven't officially been scheduled, but a senior Trump administration official said they are likely to take place on Monday in Pakistan. Vice President J.D. Vance is expected to lead the negotiations again, alongside Trump's Middle East peace envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. Key questions remain over the mechanics of a final deal, in addition to a sorting out of the future of the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. The two sides need to work out their dispute over Iran's ability to enrich uranium in the future. Trump said Friday the U.S. would get its hands on Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, though he didn't say how. The signaling comes with 4 days left before Trump's 2-week ceasefire runs out. If Iran's declaration about Hormuz is enough for Washington to say progress on opening the waterway is being made, and if a solution to Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium is within reach, there could be a path to a basic framework agreement between U.S. and Iran that would allow the ceasefire and talks to continue. Soon after the foreign minister's announcement about the strait, Iranian media outlets aligned with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps paramilitary group began to roll back the opening. The semi-official publication, Tasnim, said Iran's armed forces would supervise ship movements and would keep the waterway closed if the U.S. blockade continued. Javan, the main Revolutionary Guard newspaper, said military vessels or those linked to Iran's enemies wouldn't be allowed through. On Friday, commodities data agency Kipler said the Hormuz Strait, quote, remains effectively closed, despite Iran's announcement. Most shipping organizations said the waterway remains too unsafe to cross because of mines, while Iran's military has said it would block any vessel it doesn't authorize. Meanwhile, President Emmanuel Macron of France welcomed a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon and the announcement of the strait's reopening, but said the developments, quote, must be viewed with caution. All of this is a step in the right direction, he said after an online meeting of about 50 countries to set up an international mission that could escort ships through the strait once the fighting is over. World news to follow that. As Hormuz stakes rise, who will blink? Iran signals flexibility while Trump seeks an upper hand by continuing blockade by Yaroslav Trofimov, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The disruption of shipping from the Persian Gulf is inflicting incredible pain on America's Arab allies, on Iran, and on the world economy. The question is who suffers most and who will blink first. Until Washington imposed the naval blockade of Iranian ports April 13th, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz served as a trump card for the Iranian regime. Tehran cashed in on its own oil exports through the 40-day conflict while depriving Gulf states of critical revenue and implementing a plan to collect hefty tolls from the few passing ships. Now, as the U.S. and Iran maintain a fragile ceasefire while negotiating a much broader agreement on the nuclear issue that sparked the war, time doesn't necessarily work in Iran's favor anymore. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi gave breathing room for the negotiations and spurred a sharp decline in oil prices by saying Friday that the strait will be, quote, completely open for the duration of the ceasefire set to expire Tuesday. Shipping, however, will be allowed only along a route designated by the Iranian military that goes through an inspection area in Iranian waters, something that falls far short of fully opening the waterway and doesn't necessarily mean Tehran renounces its claim to collect passage fees. Meanwhile, the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports, quote, will remain in full force and effect until a comprehensive deal with Tehran is reached, President Trump said on Truth Social shortly thereafter. Iran's economy, in dire shape before the U.S. and Israel attacked on February 28th, has suffered from the bombing campaign and is beginning to feel the pinch of the American blockade as oil revenues and critical imports dry up. It seems that the United States wants the Iranian regime to taste its own medicine, said Saudi political analyst Salman al-Ansari. The blockade strips the only card that the Iranians have, the Strait of Hormuz, as it forces the Iranian regime to go to the negotiating table. Iranian and U.S. negotiators could meet again in coming days, and Trump said the sides are close to a deal under which Washington would secure Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, buried underground after the U.S. bombing run last summer. Tehran hasn't challenged the U.S. blockade, but that doesn't mean it won't do so in coming days, especially if negotiations stall and the ceasefire expires without meaningful diplomatic progress. A return to fighting is something Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia definitely don't want. Precision strikes by Iranian missiles and drones inflict heavy damage to their energy installations, such as refineries and petrochemical plants, while draining the reserves of air defense interceptors. Their preference is to keep the economic pressure on Iran, but with the guns remaining silent. At some point, however, as Iran's economic crisis intensifies, it will face a stark choice of whether to acquiesce to the proper reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, losing its negotiating leverage and ambition to collect tolls, or to challenge the U.S. blockade and risk a return to a full-scale war. A regional war reignited by Iran would make Tehran much more isolated in the rest of the world, as economies in Europe and Asia would be further squeezed. The idea that one country can control the Strait of Hormuz is anathema to every country in the world, said Abdel Aziz Al-Washeg, Assistant Secretary General for Political and Negotiation Affairs at the Gulf Cooperation Council, which groups the 6 Gulf monarchies. The notion that the UAE or Saudi Arabia have a higher pain tolerance than Iran only appears to be true because right now they are not being directly impacted by further attacks on critical infrastructure, said Esfandyar Batmangelciad, chief executive of the Bourse and Bazaar think tank. Iran's assumption is that on a long enough time horizon, it is still going to be able to tolerate more pain than its regional neighbors and the U.S. I just don't see how, after 8 years of maximum pressure sanctions, anything that the U.S. would do in terms of adding more economic pressure in the next few weeks meaningfully changes the calculations. The coming weeks will tell whether Tehran's assumptions are right. The conflict is no longer about which side can strike more fixed targets, said Norman Rule, who serves as the principal U.S. intelligence community's official on Iran matters from 2008 to 2017. It is now a contest over who can keep the region's commercial ship system operating and who can disrupt it. On the bottom half of the front page, in Florida, billionaires open their own schools by Deborah Acosta, Palm Beach, Florida. Not long after real estate developer Jeff Green moved from California to this exclusive Florida enclave, he noticed something sorely lacking: private school openings for all the wealthy families streaming in. So the billionaire set out to create his own pre-K to 12th grade campus. At the private Green School in West Palm Beach, students have 2 teachers per class and continue with school activities until they are summoned to line up for dismissal in precision-timed digital queue. The property feels more like a tech campus than a stuffy private school, with classes in 3D printing and another with flight simulators. One group of students is building a small airplane from scratch, which they said will be certified by the Federal Aviation Administration. In other ways, the campus resembles a summer camp with a tennis academy and sailboats. The children of South Florida's new tech titans and hedge fund managers are overwhelming the area's school system. Most private schools are full. Many are expanding but still lack even enough desks for all the children of the recently relocated executives. Now the uber wealthy are reshaping the educational landscape to meet the needs of their children and those of people like themselves. Real estate developer Stephen Ross and former WeWork chief executive Adam Newman are also springing for new campuses in the area. South Florida has plenty of new housing and shiny modern office space. It is the shortage of private school slots that is emerging as a bottleneck for more high earners relocating to the area. Those whose children are on multi-year waiting lists for the next available opening might end up moving away or never arriving in the first place. Barry Sterlicht, chief executive of Starwood Capital Group, has said repeatedly that he wanted his executives from the firm's former Connecticut headquarters to relocate to the new base in Miami Beach. But a number of them have school-age children and wouldn't move because the area's private schools have long waiting lists. Florida recently passed a series of laws to ease the cost of private school, including one that grants yearly vouchers of about $8,000 on average per student to families that choose private schools. But for the wealthy, it isn't about money so much as a lack of supply. Wealthy individuals have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build or help expand dozens of private and charter schools around Miami, West Palm Beach, and other affluent pockets of Florida. It is a long process that often involves contending with local bureaucracies and dueling with community opposition. You can't just write a check and magically have a great school, Green said. Securing land is the opening move. In West Palm, Green started by buying an abandoned car dealership. He slowly expanded over 7 acres by acquiring adjacent businesses. Developers must also recruit top-tier faculty, design a new curriculum, and prove the school's worth in a marketplace dominated by northeastern private and boarding schools founded more than a century ago. Ross, who is building a new downtown in West Palm Beach, is planning 2 new private schools. One is Wellington. The equestrian community west of Palm Beach is expected to include a 440,000 square foot campus with a performing arts program and aquatic center. He is planning a second private school 8 miles from the city's center. Crucial to the 85-year-old developer's strategy was to attract people used to dealing with anxious corporate executives, and their children's Ivy League ambitions. He recruited Karen Young from Elevate ED, a private school nonprofit, to run the Wellington School called Wingrove Academy. She hired as chief executive Jeff Clark, the former president of Avenue School, an international private school that opened its first location in Manhattan in 2012. Most of the new schools are nonprofits. Those that are for-profit are struggling to turn one, given their large sunken costs. The project cost Green $50 million in land acquisition and construction costs, plus another $10 million toward another building. His school charges $50,000 a year in tuition, though nearly half the students receive financial aid. Green said he is close to breaking even after previously losing $2 million annually. In Miami Beach, tech entrepreneur John Marshall built an elementary school that is expanding into a middle and soon a high school called Basecamp 305 that he said instills an entrepreneurial spirit. Students work with robotics and 3D printers, and those as young as kindergarten use both techniques to create toy race cars. Marshall's school charges about $30,000 a year in tuition and has around 50 students. His costs include teacher salaries above $80,000 at the high end of what private school teachers in the area make. The Marshall School also serves organic meals, which students help prepare. Those outlays exceed the school's income by a couple $1,000,000 a year. This is how private schools have historically been funded, Marshall said, by families looking to fulfill a need and then expanding. Some of these private campuses have faced community pushback. Marshall's plans to demolish a former youth hostel built during the Art Deco period to make way for a sports field was blocked by the Historic Preservation Board, which mandated he preserve the building's facade. He offered to rebuild historic elements but hasn't yet received permission to proceed. We're spending months and months and months jumping through hoops, Marshall said. In Miami's El Portal neighborhood, Newman and his wife Rebecca caused a stir with their school, SOLFL. The community erupted when Newmans demolished a church to make way for their school. About 80 students, including the couple's children, attend the school in a temporary space while they proceed with their plan and seek the local council's approval for the site. Newman's spokesperson declined to comment. Ross, meanwhile, is trying to ingratiate himself with and improve the local community by funding scholarships for hundreds of local public high school students to attend a nearby community college. At the Green School, next year's incoming freshman class will total 40 students. This year, the first graduating class of seniors, 10 in total, will collect their diplomas. Parents of his students are Ivy League graduates, Green said, adding they want their kid to get the kind of education that will get them admitted to those types of prestigious schools. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Well-Off Earners Embrace Frugality by Rachel Lewis Ensign. Well-heeled shoppers love a deal. Americans with six-figure salaries are increasingly visiting Walmart for prebiotic soda and Dollar Tree for wrapping paper. They are buying $1 boxes of pasta at discount grocer Lidl and cheese at Aldi. The shift down market is driven by the fact that even the financially comfortable are acutely aware of how much more expensive everything is today. Discounters are successfully appealing to these sticker-shocked customers through improved digital offerings and aggressive expansions into well-off neighborhoods. While affluent Americans are getting thriftier on essentials, they are still spending on extras like wellness and travel. Shoppers in households earning $150,000 or more spent 2% less at grocery stores in the first quarter compared with a year earlier, and 15% more at consignment stores, according to Consumer Edge, which tracks credit and debit card spending data. At the same time, the group spent more at luxury jewelry stores and movie theaters. These consumers are saying, I don't really like buying laundry detergent and shower gels. They're not terribly exciting. How can I save some money on those so there's more money to spend on things I enjoy like dining out or apparel, said Neil Saunders, managing director at Global Data, another firm that tracks spending. Joshua Halliburton, a 33-year-old who works in information security, started getting fed up with prices at the Whole Foods near his apartment in Brooklyn, New York. Where an Aldi opened across the street from his home in November, he was so excited for a cheaper grocery option that he attended the grand opening. He now visits the discount chain nearly every day for household staples. He is willing to wait in long checkout lines for lower prices. Meanwhile, he has continued to spend on travel, taking trips to California and Japan in the past year. Paying $4 for a tub of yogurt feels right, he said. $10 for a tub of Chobani just doesn't make sense. Some friends are now trekking from different parts of the borough to shop at the store. Consumer prices are about 25% where they were 5 years ago, and affordability is a top concern for people of all income levels. Even though the rate of inflation is far below its 2022 peak, prices aren't going down, and certain household staples such as gasoline, coffee, and beef have risen markedly in the past year. Spending by the affluent is powering the economy, helping overall consumer spending hold up. Consumer spending was up 2.5% in February from a year earlier, when adjusted for inflation, according to the latest Commerce Department numbers. Affluent people have long loved Costco, which sells gold bars and vacation packages alongside cut-rate 3-pound tubs of coffee. These customers are now discovering retailers such as Walmart and Dollar Tree that were once firmly the province of lower-income shoppers. These retailers are aggressively courting better-off customers at the same time that their traditional customers are cutting back because of inflation. Walmart's chief executive said earlier this year that most of the retailer's market share gains were with households earning more than $100,000 a year. Megan Blyle, who lives outside of Washington, D.C. and advises wealthy families, spends about $1,000 a quarter at Walmart buying items such as paper towels, cat food, and snacks for her elderly parents who live in Ohio. The 51-year-old, who earns between $150,000 and $200,000 a year, isn't trying to cut back on spending overall. When a friend visited this month, she spent more than $250 to treat her and her kids to indoor skydiving lessons. I do try and do fun stuff, she said. About 60% of all new households shopping at Dollar Tree earned more than $100,000, the retailer said in December. The company is courting these customers with a wider selection of higher-priced items, think $5, and stores more affluent areas like Plano, Texas, where the retailer opened its 9,000th store in North America last year. When CEO Mike Creedon visited the new store, he noticed Range Rovers in the parking lot. "That's a customer we never had," he said in an interview last year. Paul Alpion, 73, grew up modestly with parents who were wary of debt, and he kept that frugal mindset when he became an orthopedic surgeon in Chattanooga, Tennessee. More discount retailers have opened in his area in the past decade, and he now buys a rotisserie chicken from Costco and toothpaste and body wash from Dollar General. When he shops at the regular grocery store, he compares sizes of a product to see which is cheaper per ounce. Even though Alpion has built up his investment portfolio and a collection of classic cars, he has no plans to spend more freely on essentials. "Why would I do that?" he said. Lutnick blasts USMCA. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said Friday that President Trump considers the present U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal to be a poor deal that needs to be reconsidered and imagined. Speaking at a conference organized by media outlet Semaphore, Lutnick also criticized Canada's approach to the trade strategy with Washington, an effort by Prime Minister Mark Carney to rekindle trade ties with China. "They suck," Lutnick said. A Commerce Department spokesperson said the secretary was referring to the trade imbalance with Canada and how Canada sucks off our $30 trillion economy. The USMCA is up for a formal review, and Trump administration officials are expected to seek changes. Uncertainty about the pact, which has allowed the bulk of Canada's exports to the U.S. to enter duty-free, has cast a pall over investment and hiring plans. Making Mexico and Canada be treated like states without them being committed. It's a bad deal, Lutnick said. There's plenty of good, but there's a huge amount of bad. A spokesman for Canada's minister in charge of USMCA negotiations, Dominic LeBlanc, declined comment. During a recent testimony before Parliament, LeBlanc said Canadian officials are in talks with the U.S. counterparts to address issues of concern. Egg producers facing antitrust threat. The DOJ plans to file a civil suit as part of White House bid to tame food prices, by Dave Michaels and Patrick Thomas. Washington. The Justice Department is preparing to file an antitrust lawsuit against some of the country's biggest egg producers over allegations they coordinated pricing through information service that benchmarks prices for the industry, people familiar with the matter said. The civil lawsuit would target major producers including Cal-Maine Foods and Versova, which significantly increased egg prices in 2024 and 2025 because of a supply shortage attributed to avian flu. The competing producers share pricing information with Expana, a service that uses sales data to compile a benchmark price used by the producers. The investigation is the latest case of antitrust enforcers targeting competitors for sharing sensitive information through middlemen who recommend or help set prices. The Justice Department earlier sued RealPage, a service used by apartment landlords, and AgriStats, a consultant that assists the country's biggest poultry producers with pricing. RealPage settled the federal claims, agreeing to limit the non-public data it can use to propose rents to landlords. The AgriStats trial is scheduled for next month. An egg case, which could be filed as soon as next month, would show the Trump administration's eagerness to focus its antitrust powers on food prices, even as it warms to deal-making in other industries and looks to settle cases it inherited. The Justice Department is separately investigating the markets for beef, fertilizer, and crop seeds. No decision has been made on the egg case. The department and the egg producers could reach a settlement, the people said. The large egg companies declined to comment on the possible lawsuit. They have argued the price changes are a classic case of supply and demand, where limited supply and high demand led to higher prices. Egg farmers are price takers. They don't set prices, the market does, said American Egg Board, a trade group for egg producers. President Trump and Agricultural Secretary Brooke Rollins said lowering egg prices was a priority going back into 2025. In the spring of that year, prices skyrocketed following an egg shortage that producers attributed to the worst outbreak of avian flu in American history. Industry officials say the egg price increase, which led to prices hitting a record high of over $6 a dozen, followed from companies' inability to keep up with rebuilding their flocks amid outbreaks and panic buying by retailers and restaurants eager to secure egg supplies. Senior Justice Department officials have remarked internally that egg prices began to fall after their investigation became public, suggesting something other than market forces were at play. The bird flu outbreak has resulted in the death of roughly 200 million U.S. chickens, turkeys, and egg-laying hens since it began in 2022, according to the Agriculture Department. Entire poultry farms are routinely destroyed after a single case is found to try to prevent further spread of the disease. The bird flu outbreak is continuing and has led to the culling of millions of birds, mostly turkeys, the past few months. The disease largely spared large egg-laying hen farms that can house millions of birds in single locations this past year. The lack of cases has allowed egg companies to rebuild their flocks, sending egg prices lower for consumers. Retail egg prices were down about 45% in March compared with a year ago, the Labor Department said. The disruption hasn't gone away, said Sherman Miller, chief executive of Cal-Maine, the largest egg producer in the U.S., in an April investor call. It's still a reality, but it's not driving the same level of supply shock or panic-driven purchasing. Cal-Maine has confirmed the federal investigation in recent security filings and disclosed separate probes by the states of New York and Wisconsin. The company has said that various state attorneys general have sought to join the DOJ's investigation or have requested access to the confidential disclosures by the company to the DOJ. Several states sued egg producers the past several years under state price gouging laws, alleging unfair price increases during the pandemic. Cal-Maine settled this year with the state of Texas, agreeing to donate 2 million eggs to food banks across the state. The Justice Department probe included an examination of whether large producers had conspired to raise prices or hold back supply. The department sent letters at the time to some egg companies instructing them to preserve documents related to their pricing conversations with customers and competitors, as well as communications with Urner Barry, which is now called Expana. Expana didn't respond to requests for comment. Urner Barry has said its egg price index has been in circulation since 1858 and publishes data on spot market trades. The firm has said its methodologies are audited annually by independent third parties. People who listen to podcasts are suddenly feeling left out. Industry's embrace of video means if you're not watching, you're lost. Who? What? By David Marcellus. Jordan Blair was behind the wheel when she realized she had picked the wrong podcast to listen to. Today, we're touching down in the 70s to talk about Chippendales. Not these guys, whose name strangely comes from this guy. Harvey Guillen, the host of Killer Stories, said in the episode's intro. Who? What? Blair recalled thinking. Then she remembered. Killer Stories had begun offering a video version. When I realized there was not going to be any context given, I was a little annoyed, said Blair, a 35-year-old from Idaho. I had to find something else to listen to. The podcasting industry has been embracing video to a degree where audio-only shows are becoming the exception rather than the norm. YouTube is now the nation's largest podcasting platform. Spotify and Apple podcasters have enabled video in their feeds. Netflix is adding dozens of established podcasts to its streaming video lineup. The shift is eliciting strong opinions from longtime listeners. While some say video is boosting podcasts' appeal and making shows easier to discover on social media, others feel that their beloved medium is neglecting them as it caters to another audience. They fear that video might, once again, kill the radio star. It's almost like when somebody's telling an inside joke in front of you and you don't get it. You feel left out, Erin Molnar said of her experience listening to some podcasts. Pause in a moment, just for this moment, to remind you that you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. She was particularly concerned when her favorite show, Armchair Expert, showed videotaping interviews. That move shocked many listeners because it happened a few months after co-host Dax Shepard had vocally opposed the idea, saying it would kill the intimacy of the format and make guests too self-conscious to bare their souls on the air. Molnar, a 37-year-old marketer from Michigan, thinks the hosts have done a pretty good job of keeping the show's vulnerability intact. But she feels annoyed every time they don't explain visual references, like a gift exchange in 2024 holiday season episode. Sometimes I think you guys forget this is a podcast. Kristen Bell, Shepard's wife and guest on that episode, told the hosts, to which co-host Monica Podman quipped, "If we're not doing a good job talking about the items, I guess you should just watch it on YouTube." Molnar took that advice. Shepard didn't respond to requests for comment. Guillen, who started hosting Killer Stories in January, said, "Coming up with the right mix of visuals is still a work in progress. I think we've learned as we go along," he said, "and we listen to the fans." Many listeners say they love podcasts because they help fill in the in-between moments of life, such as exercising, driving, or grocery shopping. Having to sit down and watch kind of defeats the purpose. Betty Tice, who listens to about 7 hours of podcasts a day while performing diagnostic tests in a Colorado hospital lab, had to rejigger her lineup to weed out shows that have become too visual. The 51-year-old still regularly listens to some podcasts that pivoted to video, including the paranormal comedy show Let's Get Haunted, which she says is doing a good job keeping listeners in the loop. Allie Terry said she and Let's Get Haunted co-host Nat Strawn used to direct listeners to an Instagram page featuring images of items discussed on the podcast. But after hearing from blind listeners, she realized how important it was to carefully describe everything. Terry said they started videotaping Let's Get Haunted about a year ago, solely to produce short clips to promote the show on TikTok and other platforms. Then, last summer, they figured if they were going through the trouble of making a video show, they might as well post it. Their audience has surged multiple times over. Podcast's video expansion has become welcomed by plenty of listeners. Kyle Shiley, a 50-year-old from Minnesota, said he's been listening to web audio shows before iPods, and the word podcast even existed. The rise of YouTube and podcasting has been a boon, he said, because it's exposed him to shows he didn't know about. Katie Woodell, a 44-year-old editor from Nebraska, said watching podcasts occasionally helps avoid misunderstandings. She said listeners of Handsome, a comedy podcast, frequently take to social media to discuss perceived drama between comedian Tig Notaro and her co-hosts. Tig Notaro famously has a very dry personality and can say things that almost intentionally sound a little bit mean, Woodell said. But if you watch it, she's often very joyful, and she'll say it with a big smile on her face. Notaro said in an interview that, quote, "It's a pretty fair leap to guess that on a comedy podcast there's a lot of joking going on," end quote. Notaro frequently exhorts listeners to watch the show on YouTube, which she said is a joking nudge to listeners and a running gag among the hosts. "I would say go to YouTube, but I guess I'm annoying people by saying that," Notaro said during a late March episode, a few days after co-host Fortunate Feimster teased her about her overuse of the phrase. Fine, you're going to miss out. Turning now to opinion section, America Loses Its Will to Work by Barton Swain. In democratic peoples, where there is no hereditary wealth, everyone works to live, or has worked, or was born of people who worked. The idea of work as a necessary, natural, and honest condition of humanity is therefore offered to the human mind on every side. Thus wrote Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America about the reverence with which this country's citizens in the 1830s regarded remunerative labor. The great French writer compared aristocratic societies among whose elite work was regarded as a thing to be done for honor but not money, with the nascent bourgeois society of America, in which gainful employment was an unavoidable part of life. Half a century ago, the average college-educated American would have endorsed Tocqueville's remark and marveled that anyone would think otherwise. In the 2020s, many Americans evidence a deep confusion about the nature and purpose of work. The weakening of America's Protestant work ethic, to use a contested but irreplaceable phrase, is a complicated story, but you could trace its beginnings to the 1960s. No one has chronicled that story more incisively than Nicholas Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute. In November, Mr. Eberstadt published America's Human Arithmetic, a collection of essays mainly on the subject of labor. The book includes a 2014 address about Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, that assortment of programs begun in the mid-60s, Head Start, Medicaid, expanded food stamps, and many others. Did the war bring victory? On the one hand, today's poor live vastly more prosperous lives by any material measure than the poor of the 1960s. Talk of citizens living over or under a poverty line, that's in air quotes, poverty line, is meaningless. Mr. Eberstadt shows the de facto line having risen so dramatically upward, a fact that has little to do with government transfer payments and almost everything to do with rapid economic growth in the post-war period. On the other hand, anti-poverty programs have left more or less the same proportion of the citizenry dependent on welfare and disinclined to join the workforce. So private sector growth has made today's poor rich by comparison with their forerunners 2 generations ago, even as government anti-poverty measures have ensured that today's poor, however well off by comparison, remain dependent and resistant to upward mobility. The war on poverty hasn't only failed, it has weakened virtues its originators took for granted. 3 decades after the war on poverty began, congressional Republicans passed, and a Democratic president signed, the most sweeping reform yet made to America's welfare state. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 conditioned the most important forms of direct welfare payments on employment, or the search for employment. Opponents predicted disaster. New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, formerly a critic of America's welfare state, predicted that his colleagues who voted for the bill would, quote, take this disgrace to their graves. In fact, the reform succeeded. It moved millions off welfare rolls and into the labor market. The law mainly reformed aid to families with dependent children, which it renamed Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. But expansions and liberalizations of other safety net programs in succeeding years have negated the gains made by the 1996 law. Is a similar reform possible in 2026? Not a chance. The culture has radically changed. In the mid-1990s, politicians and commentators could still speak of America's work ethic without apology. In the 2020s, America's cognoscenti constantly suggests something baneful in the bourgeois idea that gainful toil is virtuous. Movies romanticizing manipulated workers and vilifying rapacious corporate executives. Intellectuals contending that the 5-day, 40-hour work week abuses wage laborers. Academics suggesting terms like work ethic are racist. Journalists ready to portray every worker-management relationship as exploitive. A steady stream of freshly published books crosses my desk in which the authors insist that the American workplace jades employees and managers alike. Recall also the COVID era glorification of, quote, quiet quitting, in which employees simply stopped doing their jobs they were contracted to do, and the scores of think pieces claiming that Americans, quote, work life balance, end quote, is less than optimal. Note the tacit premise that work is opposed to life. Evidence abounds that many Americans no longer consider gainful work a natural and necessary part of life. The sudden explosion of online sports betting bespeaks a nation of young men looking for ways to pocket cash for no work. The Supreme Court's 2018 decision in Murphy v. NCAA struck down a federal prohibition from 1992. By the time of that ruling, the stigma attached to sports betting had all but disappeared, and widespread legalization seemed destined one way or another. Pandemic-era measures that kept able-bodied men in their homes, bored and looking for ways to pocket a few bucks, enhanced the attractiveness of wagering on games. Americans bet $55 billion on sports. That was in 2018. In 2024, they bet $150 billion. In 2024, the sports betting phenomenon reveals, if nothing else, the loss of any notion that income should bear some relation to a product or service rendered. The bettor produces no product or services for his winnings. Indeed, that is the draw, money for nothing, or nothing that benefits anyone but the bettor. Such an ethic bothered previous generations. It bothers ours much less. Ponder also the sudden ubiquity of advertisements for personal injury law firms that promise to get their clients ample reward for damages. All over the country, one encounters them on television, radio, and billboards, with phone numbers leading to call centers that weed out weak claims. Have so many people really suffered bodily injury? An unknowing visitor to the U.S. in 2026 might be forgiven for wondering why more Americans aren't hobbling around in leg casts and wearing neck braces. Some personal injury suits are right and just, yet any moderately observant person can see that the industry, if that's the right term for it, has tapped into a massive market of Americans no longer ashamed to avoid work and rake in unearned cash. We've known for years about the slow flight of working-age men from gainful employment. Mr. Eberstadt's Men Without Work, from 2016, documents in painful detail the moral and psychological costs of men leaving the labor workforce since the mid-1960s. New and frightening is the phenomenon of, quote, disconnection among the young, both male and female. About 1 in 7 Americans in ages 18 through 24, according to a recent RAND study, are neither working nor looking for work. Many young people support a universal basic income, a government payment to every American, regardless of income or employment status. In 1996, 30 Democrats in the House and 25 in the Senate voted to reform welfare laws, and a Democratic president signed that bill. Today, approximately 0 Democrats exhibit any interest in changes to welfare programs that don't involve spending more on them. Since the death of George Floyd and attendant protests, moreover, the nation's cultural arbiters decided not to question the premises of the Great Society and war on poverty, and instead to double down on welfare state fundamentalism. If Republicans wish to do anything about America's declining work ethic, they will have to do it alone. The public knows there's a problem. Stories about the left of billions of dollars from Medicaid and other programs in Minnesota have revivified the idea that welfare programs dole out money to underserving recipients and need reform. The fraud in Minnesota, perpetrated mostly by members of the state's Somali population, is stupendous in its scope and cost, so much so that the center-left press, including the New York Times, felt obliged to cover the story. But similar stories of welfare fraud have emerged in Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, all covered by local media. Millions of ordinary Americans, moreover, saw the bogus ways in which large parts of the public sector use the 2020-2021 pandemic as an excuse not to work. They also see the major disincentives to productivity, the exploding use of marijuana, thanks to the federal government's refusal to enforce its ban, the ease with which underdeserving applicants may receive benefits from programs like women, infants, and children, among many others, and the channeling of ambitious and industrious college graduates into jobs that create no useful product or service. Academic instructors in arcane subjects, sustainability advisors, diversity coordinators, development and communications managers for activist organizations, and on and on. The rebuilding of America's work ethic is a politically saleable theme ready for use by any candidate brave enough to talk about a subject requiring a few sentences of nuanced explanation. But most Republicans avoid the subject or address it when they must, obnoxiously. Last summer, when GOP lawmakers passed a budget bill that imposed a modest work requirement on able-bodied recipients of Medicaid payments, they defended the provision in one of two ways, either by misleadingly claiming that illegal aliens' use of Medicaid dollars justified the reform, or by referring sardonically to, quote, able-bodied men in their parents' basement playing video games, end quote, or some such phrase. America's work ethic deficit goes far beyond illegal immigrants who know they risk deportation if they get caught taking benefits, and dudes living with their parents. It's true that any suggestion of reforming a federal welfare program to encourage its recipients to achieve greater financial independence will invite accusations of heartlessness, cruelty, and racism. That's politics. A genuine concern for lives distorted by unreformed welfare programs can make those accusations sound empty. Two further circumstances complicate a coherent GOP message on the work in welfare. First, a small but influential part of the party rejects the conservative insight that public handouts tend to distort incentives to work. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, the most vocal exponent of this viewpoint, last year fulminated at the overwhelming majority of his fellow Republican lawmakers who voted for a modest stiffening of a Medicaid eligibility rules. He called Medicaid working-class social insurance and cheers its expansion. Aligned with Mr. Hawley are Vice President J.D. Vance and an influential coterie of socially right-wing but state-friendly conservatives. Second, the Trump administration has made its chief policy objective the expulsion of illegal aliens. The president's political advisors show every sign of making that effort, for all its problems in execution, the central Republican message in this year's midterm elections. The great majority of Americans support the effort to deport illegal immigrants who have committed crimes other than crossing the border unlawfully, and probably a majority assents in the abstract to the defensibility of deporting all illegal aliens regardless of criminal record. But in rounding up law-abiding migrant workers, the administration has found itself targeting men looking for work in Home Depot parking lots, men who want to engage in gainful labor and who, whatever zealous Republicans might say in election year, don't draw welfare checks. Hispanics, overwhelmingly the object of zealous immigration enforcement, consistently outperform all other groups in labor force participation rates. The administration's highest priority, to put the point bluntly, appeared to be to deport guys who hang drywall, install shingles, and generally contribute to the economic growth. None of this needs stop GOP office holders and seekers from making the case for the Protestant work ethic in 2026 and beyond. Since the pandemic, American society has seemed to turn away from its presumptional faith in remunerative labor. Our belief in work, as in Tocqueville's words, a necessary, natural, and honest condition of humanity, is no longer a tacit assumption, but a disputed viewpoint. Elected leaders can't resolve the problem by passing reforms to welfare laws, but they can force the public to consider the subject. That the public will reward them for it isn't certain, but a proud nation generally likes to be reminded of its old virtues. Mr. Swaim writes the journal's Unruly Republic column. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Moving to declarations by Peggy Noonan. Trump meets his match in Pope Leo. In the 1950s, the Catholic bishop Fulton J. Sheen had a half-hour prime-time TV show on Tuesday nights called Life is Worth Living. Excuse me. It addressed the issues of the day through the lens of Catholic thought. To everyone's surprise, its ratings frequently beat its competitor, Milton Berle's #1 variety show, originally known as Texaco Star Theater. Sheen won an Emmy for Most Outstanding Personality. In his acceptance speech, famously thanked his writers Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That was a subtly unifying note for Catholics and Protestants. It is said that when Berle teased Sheen about his high ratings, Sheen replied it was because he had a better sponsor. Berle told a reporter he didn't mind the competition. After all, we're both using old material. I just thought I'd share that as our president, who grew up on Milton Berle and the great comics of early television, continues verbal war with a different prelate, Pope Leo XIV. Leo had been pointedly critical of the war in Iran, and the president responded with fury on social media, calling him weak on crime and terrible on foreign policy. As Damian Thompson noted in The Spectator, with appropriate wonder, not once in the 250-year history of the United States has a commander-in-chief launched a personal attack on the Supreme Pontiff. How odd to go to war, while already in other wars, with the head of a vast and ancient institution, a man whose job and titles include Vicar of Christ, Head of the Holy See, and Bishop of Rome, and who is the spiritual leader of 1.4 billion Catholics and the biggest Christian denomination in America. The Pope, you might say, has a certain moral standing. In any case, popes don't cheer wars, which are always a calamity, a result of failure, and a killer of the innocent. The president's comments speak of something disordered in the administration's relationship to faith. On April 1st, at a White House Easter lunch, with the president standing behind her, Paula White-Cain, head of the administration's faith office, compared President Trump to Christ. Jesus taught so many lessons through his death, burial, and resurrection. And Mr. President, no one has paid the price like you have paid the price. It almost cost you your life. You were betrayed and arrested and falsely accused. It's a familiar pattern that our Lord and Savior showed us. It was quite something. If you really believe in Christ, as a Christian preacher should, you wouldn't compare him to any leader of this world. That wasn't an act of misdirected reverence, but a refusal of reverence. What is going on with this administration and its use and abuse of Christianity? Shouldn't the great churches of America be thinking about this, and at this point talking about it publicly, thoughtfully? Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, earlier in the Iran war, stood in the Pentagon and issued a call for a wartime prayer. Every day, on bended knee, with your family, in your schools, in your churches, the American people should pray in the name of Jesus Christ. On Thursday, he compared mainstream media reporters to the enemies of Christ, the Pharisees who held counsel against him to destroy him. The press, he said, is just like these Pharisees. He clarified he meant the legacy Trump-hating press. American presidents during war have always called on God for help and guidance, deliberately not the Lord of one faith, but all. And none have ever used the story of Christ to undermine the president's critics. I am becoming shocked by what I am seeing here, and as a registered pundit, my response to shock tends toward counter-rudeness. A reader sent a note this week saying he'd been following the president's attacks on the Pope and is following up posting of the artificial intelligence image depicting him as Christ healing the sick. And it sent him to the Sermon on the Mount. Consider what Jesus said, the reader urged, and the things Trump says. I did. Christ. Blessed are those who are poor. Mr. Trump, part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. My whole life I've been greedy, greedy, greedy. I've grabbed all the money I could get. Christ. Blessed are the meek. Mr. Trump. It has been stated by many that the first month of our presidency is the most successful in the history of our nation. You know who number 2 is? George Washington. Christ. Blessed are the merciful. Mr. Trump. I am your retribution. Why are we having all these people from S-hole countries come here? Christ, blessed are the peacemakers. Mr. Trump, a whole civilization will die tonight. He died like a dog. He died after running into a dead-end tunnel, whimpering and crying and screaming. Christ, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you. Mr. Trump, I love getting even with people. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. Some common subject matter, but rather different approaches. So different that Mr. Trump's statements seem the photographic negative of the Sermon on the Mount. I used the word hick last week, not one people use much anymore, but one that should be redefined and reoriented, because it's a growing public style. Old meaning of hick, hayseed, rube, ill-educated person. But modern hickdom doesn't have anything to do with geography, class, profession, circumstances of birth. It has to do with character, disposition. You can be a Harvard hick, a Palm Beach hick. What all hicks have in common is that they lack respect. They lack a shown courtesy toward people or things that deserve a measure of homage. They don't have the bandwidth to know what should be respected in the world, or what and who helps it turn. They aren't skeptical, but cynical. They think they're wised up, but they lack something essential, a broad and sympathetic imagination. And they are all over Washington. A hick picks a fight with a pope. Vice President J.D. Vance is a man of fairly frequent conversions, from fiercely anti to fiercely pro-Trump, from Silicon Valley mover to Midwestern populist, to Catholicism. And you can't expect a 41-year-old man who moves with such speed to keep perfect track of all his latest convictions. But Mr. Vance admonished the Pope before an audience at the University of Georgia this week, saying if Leo was going to opine on matters of theology, he should be anchored in truth. In the same way that the vice president must be careful when he talks about public policy, it's very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. Well, yes, but wow. Be careful? Opines on theology? Talking down to the leader of a great church from your height of 7 years as a member? Who died and made you Pope? Leo can take care of himself. His ex-post on Thursday? Woe to those who manipulate religion in the very name of God for their own military, economic, and political gain, dragging that which is sacred into darkness and filth. To the extent anyone ever wins these things, he will. He has a better sponsor and better writers. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 18th and 19th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition. We read from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition every Monday at 7 a.m. Your reader has been Dan. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Volunteer radio readers broadcast daily readings, 24 hours a day, of newspapers, magazines, books, and other printed matter to area people who are blind or have a print disability, who are provided reading radios. The Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service has broadcast almost 40 years of radio readings to those without sight. Our broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNED. Radio Reading Studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga. For more information on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, call 716-821-5555. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability